Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in southern France. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1862, in the quiet limestone valleys between Arles and Salon, D. Province, where the sun itself seemed to bleach secrets from the soil. Among the olive groves and lavender fields stood Maison Verlaine, a weathered estate of faded grandeur. Its ochre facade cracked like dried parchment, its tall shutters always half closed, as though watching. Local records describe the owner, Comte Lucien Verlaine, as a man of refined melancholy. He had returned from the Caribbean colonies 2 decades earlier, bringing with him not only strange botanical specimens and a taste for foreign music, but also an unnamed servant, a young person whose origins were deliberately obscured on every official paper. The Registre des Domestiques for 1861 lists them only as Adrien, age approximately 22, complexion umber, hair dark and fine, no birthplace given, no surname. A single note in the margin reads, double nature, discretion advised. Neighbors recalled seeing this figure at dusk, gliding between cypress trees in garments neither distinctly male nor female. One could not tell, wrote Abbé Moreau in his parish journal, if the Count had acquired a servant or a mirror. At the time, the Second French Empire was at its height. Paris glittered under Napoleon I's reforms, but the countryside kept its shadows. It was whispered that the Verlaine estate had once functioned as a resting post for slave ships returning through Marseille, though no proof was ever produced. Still, the presence of Adrien seemed to stir those whispers again. Household staff later testified that the Comtesse, Elise Verlaine, had grown strangely dependent on the servant. They shared the same rooms of air, wrote the housekeeper, Madame Pujol, in a letter preserved by the diocesan archives. If one laughed, the other echoed it. If one fell ill, the other faded. By midsummer of 1862, the estate's gardener, Heaton Richard, noted a change in both master and mistress. The Count smiled at last, he wrote in his notebook, and she, poor lady, began to vanish in health. There were no disturbances yet, no reports of violence, disappearance, or madness. Only that quiet, eerie transformation of affection into dependence, of service into obsession. Later historians would remark that such episodes were not uncommon in the twilight of the aristocracy. Under the Second Empire, appearances mattered more than truth, and secrets were maintained with the same discipline as gardens. But no one could have foreseen how far the Verlaine case would unravel, how those same lavender fields would, by the year's end, conceal the first of several shallow graves, and always, in each testimony, the same refrain appeared: they were both possessed by one who belonged to neither world. The archives of Boches, du Rorny, preserved in the sub-prefecture of Arles, contain a curious folder marked Incident, Verlaine, 1862. Inside are brittle papers, half-eaten by humidity and time, bearing the signatures of local constables, physicians, and one Dr. Auguste Lambert, a physician once associated with the regional military hospital. From these fragments, we learn that the first disturbance at Maison Verlaine began quietly. Sometime in late September of 1862, the Comte had taken ill after a week of intense mistral winds. His wife, Elise, refused to summon a priest, relying instead on the constant presence of Adrien, who slept on a cot beside his bed. In a sworn affidavit, the maid Clotilde Servan recalled, "When I entered to bring broth, I saw the servant sitting near the master's head. Their hands were together as if in prayer, yet their eyes were closed. The master's breath came in gasps, and the servant's chest moved with the same rhythm, like a reflection in water. For 3 days, Neither left the chamber. When the doctor arrived, he found the Comte greatly recovered, but Elise, the mistress, pale and near delirium. Her letters from that period are incoherent, filled with lines such as, "He passes between us like a current, one breath, two bodies." In the broader world, the Second French Empire still projected progress and order. Newspapers in Marseille boasted of new railways and colonial ventures. Yet, in the rural heart of Provence, among peasants who still lit their candles to ward off spirits of the Mistral, this was seen differently. Town gossip turned the Verlaine household into a living parable. The house where gender and soul were confused. A few months later, the parish journal recorded a brief note, December 3rd. Rumor persists of unnatural intimacy between the lady of the house and her servant. Her confession is postponed indefinitely. That same winter, 2 field workers reported seeing lamplight in the vineyard at impossible hours. One claimed to have heard Elise's voice calling from the fields when she was, by all accounts, confined to her room. But the strangest account comes from Dr. Lambert's second report, dated February 1863, found years later among estate ledgers sold to a bookseller in Avignon. Upon examination of the servant, called Adrian or Adrienne, I am uncertain of the proper pronoun, the body displays both aspects of sex, yet in such delicate balance that I hesitate to conclude. The subject appears neither ashamed nor proud, but merely divided. This clinical tone hides more than it reveals. He concludes the note with a chilling observation. There is a resemblance of features between the servant and the mistress, as though one had been modeled upon the other's image. By the spring, though, Elise Verlaine was rarely seen. The Comte took his meals alone, his eyes clouded, while the servant managed the house in silence. To visitors, Maison Verlaine seemed returned to order, but among the villagers, fear had settled like dust, too quiet, too even, too still. No one yet suspected that within a year's time, both master and servant would vanish, and the only witness left behind would be a housekeeper who spoke of 2 voices speaking through one throat. In the summer of 1863, Maison Verlaine appeared to have regained its poise. The vines along its southern wall were trimmed, the shutters freshly painted, and the carriage road raked smooth each morning by the servant Adrian or Adrienne. Yet those who passed along the road to Aiguillet remarked that the estate seemed uninhabited. No laughter from the veranda, no music from the salon, only a faint echo of a piano heard late at night when the wind turned north. According to Madame Pujol, the long-serving housekeeper, the Comte had grown increasingly withdrawn. He held his correspondence behind locked drawers, burned letters at dawn, and forbade entry to the east wing of the house. His wife Elise was said to be convalescing in her chamber under nervous exhaustion. The local doctor, Lambert again, visited weekly, but his notes grow shorter, ending abruptly in May with the line, "Condition beyond ordinary science. Affinity between patient and servant is pathological." Meanwhile, townsfolk began to share peculiar stories. A shepherd claimed he saw, one twilight, 2 silhouettes walking the vineyard path, identical in form, hand in hand. The baker's son, returning late from Ceylon, swore he met Madame Verlaine at the crossroads, though her husband had told the parish she was confined. When pressed, he insisted it was her. But her eyes were dark like the servant's, and her voice was neither man's nor woman's. By August, the priest at St. Lazare parish recorded the Comte's rare confession. His handwriting trembles. He spoke of guilt, of unnatural affection, and of a soul split between 2 bodies. He begged absolution for loving what God had not named. The priest advised separation of the household, sending the servant away to relatives or a sanatorium. The Comte agreed, but the letter of release was never posted. A surviving police register from Arles, dated November 1863, confirms that the gendarmerie received an unsigned report of cries and violent disturbances from the Verlaine property. Constables dispatched the following morning found the estate calm, with Adrian tending the fire, and no trace of distress. Elise remained unseen. 2 weeks later, the gardener E. Hun resigned, leaving a short testimony written in pencil on the back of an unpaid invoice. There is something unholy here. The servant walks the halls at dawn dressed in the mistress's gown. I heard 2 voices reciting from the same throat, one pleading, one laughing. I will not return. Within months, both the Comte and Adrian vanished. Their horses were left in the stable, untouched bread on the kitchen table, no signs of struggle. Only Elise remained, fragile, silent, seated by the window overlooking the vineyards. When questioned by the local magistrate, she answered softly, "They are still here, but you cannot see them. They are inside me." The statement was dismissed as hysteria, yet it marked the first time provincial authorities considered Maison Verlaine more than a tale of gossip. Even now, historians of the Second French Empire note that rural reports of divided souls and mirrored lovers often masked hidden abuses, forbidden relationships, or psychological collapse under the rigid codes of class and gender. Yet in this case, even the doctors who studied Elise's decline admitted uncertainty. In his final journal entry, Dr. Lambert wrote, "If one could cleave the spirit as easily as flesh, perhaps she would be cured, but the division seems already complete." By early 1864, the estate of Maison Verlaine had fallen under official inquiry. The magistrate, Henry Duplessis, dispatched from Arles, arrived in March to review the disappearances of Comte Lucien Verlaine and his servant Adrian. Both last seen during the harvest months of the previous year, the procis verbal of his initial inspection survives in fragmented form, held today in the departmental archives. It describes the house as exceptionally ordered, yet strangely airless, its mirrors draped in black silk, and its windows sealed from the inside. Elise Verlaine, though visibly frail, was composed and polite. She offered tea, spoke of her husband as though he were abroad on business, and referred to the servant in the present tense. He tends to the garden, though he dislikes the morning light. Duplessis, a rationalist of the post-Enlightenment school, dismissed early rumors of possession or madness. His notes reflect only curiosity at the symmetry of the house's arrangement. 2 bedrooms joined by a narrow gallery, identical portraits facing each other across the corridor, 2 clocks ticking in unison. Both stopped at 3:10. During a second visit, the magistrate brought a clerk and a constable. They discovered, behind a tapestry in the disused east wing, a sealed doorway leading to a narrow stairwell descending beneath the drawing room. What they found below was not a crypt nor a wine cellar, but a small chamber lined with mirrors. In its center stood 2 chairs, facing one another. On the wall, an inscription scratched into plaster, "Where one ends, the other begins." There was no evidence of violence, only a faint odor of perfume and lamp oil. The constable, Franos Regal, later swore under oath that one of the mirrors showed movement though none of the men had shifted. It was like a breath. He testified, a sigh behind the glass. Meanwhile, the villagers whispered that the Comte had fled to Marseille, seeking passage to the colonies, though no record of his embarkation exists in the port registry. Others believed Adrian had killed him and taken his place, an idea reinforced by reports of a figure seen wandering near the Verlaine vineyards at twilight, dressed in the Comte's coat. By summer, Elise's health deteriorated sharply. Dr. Lambert, still the attending physician, wrote, "She speaks now in alternating tones, her own voice, soft and tremulous, and another lower, precise, foreign to her nature. I cannot attribute it to deceit. Her pulse quickens when she says the name Adrian. as though recalling herself. The doctor's use of the term dual consciousness predates later medical studies by nearly 2 decades, suggesting this case may have influenced early provincial discussions of identity and hysteria. In July, Elise was transferred to the Maison de Santé-Sainte Marthe, a private asylum outside Avignon, where she remained until 1868. Maison Verlaine was shuttered, its contents inventoried under state supervision. Among the effects listed were 2 journals, one in the Comte's hand, the other unsigned. Both ended on the same day, October 19, 1863, with nearly identical final sentences. I have entered her. E is inside me. The discovery was never made public. When Maison Verlaine was sealed by court order in late 1864, its story might have ended there, folded quietly into the archives of provincial scandals. But 5 years later, in 1869, a curious figure appeared in Marseille, a young performer at the Théâtre Lyrique, going by the stage name Adrienne Dulise. The resemblance to the missing servant of the Verlaine estate was striking enough to stir local rumor. The same androgynous grace, the same pale features, the same ambiguous allure. Witnesses described a beauty neither male nor female, yet wholly consuming. A journalist for l'Essai Maffort de Marseille attended one of Adrienne's performances and wrote, "The voice, if such a word suffices, seems to carry both timbres of man and woman, as if an unseen harmony wove through a single throat. It unsettles the audience in ways not easily confessed." When asked about origins, Adrienne replied only, "From a house in the Lavender Hills, long asleep." It was around this time that Dr. Lambert, retired but still haunted by his earlier patient, wrote a paper for a medical journal in Paris entitled Observations sur une âme partagée, Notes on a Divided Soul. In it, without naming names, he revisited the Verlaine case, comparing it to the growing interest among psychiatrists in dédoublement de la personnalité, split personality. He mentioned the era of the Second French Empire, calling it an age of surfaces, where even the mind sought to appear as two. Midway through his account, Lambert describes receiving a letter, unsigned but sealed with the Verlaine crest. Inside was a single sentence: "You mistook what was divine for what was diseased." He never discovered who sent it. Later that same year, Elise Verlaine was released from the asylum, declared mentally stable but weak of constitution. She retired to a convent near Aix, en Provence, where she lived under the name Esmina Marie, Sile Mens. Nuns who knew her recalled that she often stared into mirrors during morning prayers, whispering phrases in a voice not her own. One evening in 1871, a fire consumed part of the convent's east wing. Among the casualties listed in the parish register was Esmina Marie, Clemence, burned beyond recognition. Yet the nuns insisted she had been seen afterward, walking along the cloister's outer wall, her veil untouched by ash. A letter preserved by the Mother Superior reads, "She said she was leaving to meet him." Her reflection. That same month, the Théâtre Lyrique in Marseille closed temporarily after a scandal involving Adrienne Dulise. The performer vanished following a final performance of Orphée aux Enfers, during which audience members swore that Adrienne's face seemed to shift, first masculine, then feminine, then blank as glass. Dr. Lambert's notes end there, but a later marginalia, added by an anonymous hand, includes a chilling remark: "Shine again, briefly, at Avignon station, boarding the train north, wore morning black, no shadow." Whether Adrienne Dulise and Adrienne Verlaine were one and the same, no record can prove. Yet the convergence of names, years, and witnesses leaves historians uneasy. The Second French Empire would collapse the following year, in 1870, beneath the weight of war and revolution. Many records of the old order, servants, estates, forgotten scandals, perished in those turbulent years. But among the few that remain, the file labeled Verlaine, 1862-1864 survives, its ink faded, its testimony still incomplete, and its final line underlined twice in red, "No burial located." The decades that followed the fall of the Second French Empire saw France remade, new republics, new science, and a rising fascination with what one 19th-century philosopher called les profondeurs de l'esprit, the depths of the mind. Yet in Provence, in the dusty townships between Salon and Arles, the legend of Maison Verlaine never quite died. Farmhands avoided the road that skirted the estate, claiming that the shutters sometimes opened by themselves at dusk. Traveling salesmen who stayed at the nearby inn recorded hearing a faint duet, drifting from the abandoned vineyards, a woman's lament entwined with a man's baritone. In 1879, a visiting antiquarian named Professor Jules Moret undertook to catalogue the vanishing country houses of Provence. His notes on Maison Verlaine are among the most detailed sources we have. He describes the structure as remarkably preserved, yet marked by an imbalance of symmetry, as though every doorway concealed its own reflection. In a drawer of the study, he discovered a tarnished hand mirror wrapped in silk and bound with twine. Across its back, etched in uneven letters, were the words, "He is the breath within her sleep." Moret, a skeptic by nature, dismissed the inscription as an eccentric flourish, but his later diary contradicts that confidence. "I dreamed," he wrote, "that a figure stood beside my bed, luminous and sexless, asking if I would trade silence for sight. When I woke, the mirror lay on the table, uncovered." He left the estate the next day and never returned. Meanwhile, in Paris, interest in duality and identity began to influence both medicine and literature. Physicians debated hysterical somnambulism, while poets romanticized the double fitra, the divided being. Some scholars later speculated that the Verlaine case, circulated quietly through Lambert's paper Observations sur une âme partagée, may have inspired several fictional treatments of androgyny and possession in the Fen dit salons. By the 1880s, Maison Verlaine had been purchased by a minor noble family from Avignon, who intended to renovate it for summer use. Their tenancy lasted less than 2 seasons. The Baroness, Henriette de Villon, wrote to a cousin, "What cannot abide the house? At night, the mirrors fog though no breath is near, and my husband speaks in his sleep as if answering someone unseen." In September 1883, their steward disappeared, leaving behind a trunk containing a single item, a theatre poster from Marseille dated 1869. On it, the name Adrienne Dulise had been carefully crossed out and replaced in ink with Elise Verlaine. The family fled within the week. Local officials again inspected the property, but found nothing beyond the usual decay of age and neglect. The constable's report ends curtly. House abandoned. No evidence of crime. Recommend demolition. Yet the demolition never occurred. By 1890, the estate had become a destination for spiritualists, amateur mesmerists, and the occasional foreign traveler drawn by rumor. They spoke of a stillness inside, a kind of perfect equilibrium of light and shadow. Some claimed to see, in the great salon's remaining mirror, 2 figures seated together. One in mourning black, the other radiant in white. Neither reflected in the other's eyes. A final notation in the departmental register from 1901 records that Maison Verlaine was struck by lightning during a summer storm. The roof burned, but the mirrored chamber below was untouched. When officials entered to assess the damage, they found the air thick with soot and lavender smoke. On the wall above the 2 facing chairs, a new line had been carved into the plaster, as if by a desperate or reverent hand. Where one ends, the other still begins. By the early 20th century, Maison Verlaine had slipped fully into legend. The new century brought trains, telegraphs, and industry, yet the peasants of Provence still crossed themselves when passing the Vine Road at dusk. They said the air there carried 2 breaths, one warm, one cold. In 1907, a British travel writer, Miss Eleanor Hartwell, journeyed through the region compiling notes for her book Southern Spirits of France. Her chapter on the Verlaine estate, though dismissed by academics as superstition, remains the most haunting account ever recorded. Hartwell described entering the ruins with a local guide. The ceilings had collapsed in places, ivy choking the arches, yet the grand salon remained eerily intact. It was as if, she wrote, time had spared this one chamber for its own reasons. The central mirror stood unbroken, despite decades of storms. When Hartwell raised her lantern, she saw not her reflection, but a pair, a man and woman seated side by side, heads inclined toward one another in silence. Their faces, she said, held the calm of those who no longer ask to be forgiven. Her guide fled the room. Hartwell, trembling but resolute, approached the glass. She noticed something etched faintly at its base. Letters nearly erased by age and dust. Ni homme, ni femme, mais les souvenirs des dix. Neither man nor woman, but the memory of both. She left the estate at sunrise. In her notes, she added a final observation that scholars have debated for decades. At dawn, I heard music, not human, but harmonic, as though two notes sustained each other endlessly, neither dominant, neither fading. And then, silence. Hartwell returned to London and never published her manuscript. She died in 1912, her papers sealed until their rediscovery in 1954. When historians finally examined them, several pages near the Verlaine entry had been torn out. Still, interest rekindled briefly after the Second World War, when soldiers stationed nearby used the ruins as a camp. Many reported sleepless nights, plagued by dreams of a woman whispering in an unfamiliar tongue. One lieutenant later described hearing a heartbeat, not my own, when standing near the mirror frame. By the 1970s, the house was declared unsafe and closed by the French Ministry of Culture. Yet trespassers continued to slip inside. Among them was a photographer from Lyon, Marc Aubriot, who captured the last known image of the mirror room in 1978. In his notes, Aubriot wrote, "The glass no longer reflects the viewer. It shows only the room itself, empty, waiting. And yet, when the light falls just right, one might swear there is someone sitting in the far chair." The negative of that photograph has never been recovered. Today, nothing remains of Maison Verlaine but a scatter of stones and the faint outline of its foundations beneath wild olive and rosemary. Locals claim that on certain evenings, if the mistral blows from the east, you can still hear two voices, one pleading, one consoling, fused into a single breath carried across the fields. Some say it is a warning. Others, a love that refused to dissolve. But those who listen too long never seem quite the same again. In 1993, more than a century after the last official mention of Maison Verlaine, the legend resurfaced in the most unlikely of ways. A university research project. At the Université d'Aix, Marseille, a postgraduate student named Dr. Camille Duret began compiling oral histories of rural myths in southern France. Among dozens of tales about ghosts, saints, and miracles, one caught her attention. The mirror that remembers. Locals told her that the glass once belonged to a nobleman's wife who shared her lover's soul with her husband, and that anyone who looked into it alone might see both what they were and what they feared to become. Intrigued by the consistency of the stories, Duret obtained permission to survey the ruins of Maison Verlaine, now barely visible beneath overgrowth. She brought with her a small research team, a drone camera, and ground-penetrating radar. What they uncovered was astonishing: the remains of a circular foundation beneath what would have been the main salon. An architectural design unknown in other 19th-century Provence estates. At its center lay fragments of what appeared to be silvered glass, thick and unusually dark. On the reverse side, laboratory tests later confirmed traces of mercuric nitrate, a dangerous substance once used in mirror making but abandoned by the mid-1800s. Oddly, the levels of mercury were higher than expected, suggesting deliberate modification. It was as if the mirror was designed not to reflect perfectly, Durrett wrote in her field report, but to absorb. During one of the team's night sessions, the motion sensors recorded a short burst of electromagnetic interference, followed by what the audio file captured as a two-toned hum, a sustained note composed of two frequencies beating against each other in harmony. The phenomenon occurred only once. None of the instruments detected a source. The discovery sparked interest among paranormal researchers and psychologists alike. Theorists of collective memory proposed that the Verlaine mirror acted as a symbolic vessel for the trauma of its time, an artistic expression of a society grappling with gender, power, and possession. Others, more sensationally, claimed it had literally stored psychic resonance from its former occupants. In 1997, Durrett presented her findings at a conference in Lyon. Afterward, she was approached by an elderly man identifying himself as Jean Lambert, a descendant of the physician who had once documented the Verlaine case in 1864. From his coat, he produced a sealed envelope containing a single, faded photograph. The image, though cracked and faint, showed two silhouettes standing in front of what could only be the mirror. One in a white gown, the other in black formal wear. Between them shimmered a faint third form, translucent, its outline neither male nor female, but somehow both. Experts argued the photo was a long exposure or a double exposure trick. Yet the atmosphere of the image, the tenderness of the hands nearly touching, was undeniable. When asked how his family came to possess the photograph, Lambert's reply was cryptic. Because the mirror never belonged to them, it belonged to what they created. The photo was submitted to the archives of the Musée d'Histoire de Provence, where it remains today under controlled conditions. Durrett, after years of research, retired quietly from academia. In her final interview, she confessed that she had once dreamed of the mirror calling her by name, urging her to come see what lies between. She never returned to the site again. In the years that followed Dr. Durrett's retirement, Maison Verlaine slipped once again into obscurity. The ruins were fenced off after a small wildfire swept through the hillside in 2003, blackening the olive groves and leaving the stones warm to the touch for days. Yet, in the ashes of that summer, something unexpected reawakened. The legend of the dual soul began circulating online. By 2006, a series of amateur photographers visiting Provence started uploading strange images tagged with Verlaine ruins or Maison du Marais. Each photo shared an eerie pattern, faint distortions, twin shadows where only one person had stood, and a pale, vertical streak bisecting faces, like the reflection of someone not in frame. Skeptics dismissed these as exposure errors, lens flares, or deliberate hoaxes. But one post drew serious attention. A Parisian historian named Elodie Marchand, studying colonial archives, stumbled upon a photograph resembling the same mirror Dr. Durrett had unearthed decades prior. Its silvered surface was warped, but the accompanying caption chilled her. Taken from the house of Verlaine, returned from Saint-Domingue, 1832. Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, had been a central site of French colonial slavery. The note implied that the mirror itself, or at least its materials, had crossed the ocean with the Verlaine family after the Haitian Revolution. Marchand's research revealed that Etienne Verlaine, an ancestor of Julien, had owned plantations in the Caribbean. It was there, according to one shipping ledger, that he purchased a servant of dual appearance, recorded under both genders. The ledger entry matched the estimated age and origin of the dual sold servant from family letters recovered in Provence. If the dates aligned, the enslaved individual, known only by the initial C in correspondence, had been brought to France in 1849 and assigned to the household. By reintroducing this thread, Marchand reopened old wounds. The discovery forced local historians to confront how colonial exploitation and domestic transgression intertwined, how the same object, the mirror, might have bridged both. In her notes, Marchand paraphrased a line from the old physician's journal. "There are two mirrors in every home, one for the face and one for the conscience." The phrase circulated widely, quoted in documentaries and online forums dedicated to haunted objects. Yet beneath the spectacle, the truth was far more human. A story of ownership, desire, and blurred identity born from systems that treated people as property. By 2010, Maison Verlaine was officially declared a restricted archaeological zone. Access was prohibited without a research permit. Yet, despite warnings, trespassers continued to climb the hill at night. Some claimed to hear faint humming from beneath the soil, the same dual-toned resonance once captured by Durit's team. A few even reported seeing their reflections shimmer against the dark stone, as if the mirror's surface had fused with the ruins themselves. I saw my own face. One local hiker told a Marseille newspaper in 2011, but it blinked when I hadn't. Investigators dismissed the accounts, but patterns persisted. Each report mentioned the same faint, chemical smell, something metallic and sweet, like mercury. Scholars revisiting the Verlaine records noticed a consistent theme. Wherever the mirror was mentioned, something followed. Rumors of divided selves, split voices, and couples descending into jealousy. It was no longer a love story or a haunting, but a mirror held up to the fractures within society itself. As one curator at the Musée d'Histoire put it, Maison Verlaine was not cursed. It simply reflected more than it should have. Two documents, discovered in 1874 within a sealed drawer at a notary's office in Marseille, remain the only first-hand testimonies from those entangled in the Verlaine tragedy. Both are dated April 1862, written just weeks before the household's collapse. They were addressed to the same person, Father Mathieu Reynaud, the parish priest of Saint-Arrêt-Mai, Dique, Provence. The first letter, penned by Isabelle Verlaine, was long believed to be a confession of adultery, but its tone was far more complex, less guilt, more bewilderment. "Mon Pierre," she began, "I no longer know where I end and where another begins. I wake with hands that are not mine, with words in my mouth that I do not recall learning. My husband watches me as though I were two beings, one his wife, the other his rival." She described dreams of a mirror that breathed, a surface that shimmered like living flesh. She spoke of hearing footsteps matching hers in perfect rhythm, even when she stood still. "When I speak," she wrote, "I hear an echo that does not wait for me to finish." Her writing grows erratic halfway through the letter, the ink darker, pressed with more force. In her final lines, Isabelle pleads for the release of two souls that share one sorrow. Historians interpret her words as psychological decline, perhaps worsened by isolation and her husband's volatile temperament. Yet her descriptions mirror, almost word for word, phrases found in the second testimony, written by the enslaved servant, referred to only as CC's letter, though brief, is composed with startling clarity. It is written in French, but with hints of Creole syntax, suggesting a native Caribbean origin. "Madame believes she dreams, but I do not. The glass took something from both of us. It wants to be whole, but it must choose which face to keep." C mentions a ritual of breath and light, perhaps metaphorical, describing how the mistress insisted on lighting candles before the mirror each night. One white, one black. Between them, their reflections would merge into a third shape, indistinct yet vividly alive. Head Julien Verlaine says he sees only her. She says she sees only me. I see both, and both see me. The letter ends abruptly with a smear of ink, as if the paper were torn away mid-sentence. The priest, Father Reynaud, reportedly received neither letter. Both were found unsent, sealed with wax, but never delivered. In the notary's margin, a clerk later scribbled a note recovered from estate sale documents of 1863, origin uncertain. Do not reopen. Disturbing content. The authenticity of these letters has been debated for decades. Forensic analysis of the ink and paper confirms they date to the correct period, though critics claim they were literary forgeries, created to embellish the legend. Still, the emotional consistency between Isabel's fevered prose and C's calm fatalism suggests something genuine, a convergence of minds under immense psychological strain. What haunts researchers most is that the handwriting in both letters, though superficially distinct, shows identical pressure points and slant angles. When analyzed digitally in 2014, experts noted that in several places, strokes from one letter perfectly overlaid those from the other, as if written by the same trembling hand at different moments of consciousness. It was as though, at the end, there truly was only one writer, split between two names. By autumn of 1862, the household of Maison Verlaine had thinned to silence. The servants had left under vague pretexts, citing "all airs" and "voices from the walls." Only Julian, Isabel, and C remained in the great stone manor, with shutters drawn tight even during the heat of late September. What transpired that final week is known only through fragments. A physician's notes, a constable's record, and the testimony of a passing trader who found the front gate open and the house unguarded. According to Dr. Louis Armand, summoned days later, the home showed no signs of forced entry. The dining table was laid for three, though all the plates remained untouched. Candles had burned down completely, their wax fused into the silver holders. In the salon, where the great mirror once stood, the marble floor bore deep scratches in a circular pattern, as if something heavy had been dragged and turned repeatedly in place. It was a scene of interruption, not violence, Armand wrote, as though life had been called away mid-movement. The mirror itself was gone. Only the gilded frame remained, leaning against the wall, its edges warped by heat or pressure. On the opposite wall, faint discoloration formed a tall, oval shape, its center darker than the rest, like a shadow left behind. Dr. Armand found Isabel's gown folded neatly on the chaise near the window. Beside it lay a torn scrap of fabric, believed to be part of C's linen robe, stained with mercury residue. The smell of metal was so intense that Armand noted it made his eyes water. Julian Verlaine was discovered in his study, seated upright, his expression oddly peaceful. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, though the physician remarked a curious detail. His pupils were dilated unequally, as if his eyes had seen two different things at once. No bodies matching Isabel or C were ever found. A constable named Henry Valois led the brief investigation that followed. His written report, filed October 8, 1862, described a private séance of spiritual nature, gone wrong. He mentioned hearing of a local mystic from Arles who had sold the couple tinctures and powders to bind love beyond the flesh. When questioned, the mystic, identified only as Madame Sorel, denied ever meeting them but admitted to hearing the whispers of those who looked too long at themselves. By the year's end, the property was seized for debt. The mirror was never recovered. Locals began to say that on clear nights, when the moon struck the western windows of the abandoned manor, the glass returned for a moment. A faint shimmer in the air where no surface stood. Travelers spoke of seeing two shapes there, facing each other across invisible distance, always just beyond clarity. Dr. Armand, writing decades later, recalled returning once in 1879 to the ruins. He claimed to have found the faint outline of a handprint on the inside of the wall, where the mirror had hung, pressed into stone as if softened from within. It was not carved, he wrote, but as if the wall itself had yielded to a living palm. The report was dismissed as the ramblings of an aging physician. Yet, after his death, that same wall segment was discovered missing when the estate was surveyed for auction. No buyer ever came forward. In time, the legend of the Mirror of Maison Verlaine merged with Provençal folklore, told as a warning about love that ignores boundaries, about reflections that stare back too long. Parents whispered it to children as Le Miroir du Partage, the mirror of division. And yet, in old church registers, a curious annotation appears in Father Renaud's handwriting, dated November 1862's, received confession from a voice not seen. It spoke in two tones. It asked for absolution for them both. By the turn of the 1870s, Maison Verlaine had already passed into rumor. Farmers and shepherds in the hills of Provence spoke of La Maison aux deux voix, the house with two voices. Few remembered the real names behind it, yet the details survived in peculiar fragments. A vanished wife, a foreign servant, and a mirror that devoured both. One of the earliest public mentions after the tragedy appeared in Le Petit Provence, dated January 1871. The article, buried between market notices and shipping timetables, described a rural tale of divided souls, circulating in the Avignon region. The anonymous author likened it to the stories of mad mirrors that had spread during the height of the Second French Empire, when mesmerism, spiritism, and pseudo-scientific seances captivated the bourgeois' imagination. It is said, the piece read, that the mirrors of certain noble houses do not merely reflect, but remember. Artists soon found fascination in the story. In 1873, a painter from Marseille named Claude Verlaine exhibited a canvas titled Defix Riflets, Two Reflections, at the Salon des Encmes. The painting depicted a woman and a man standing before a fractured mirror, their bodies merging into a single figure whose face was obscured by light. Critics praised its haunting ambiguity, calling it allegory of conscience. None realized that Verlaine's summer studio had once been just a few kilometers from the ruins of Maison Verlaine. Folklorists collecting rural legends noted that locals treated the story not as a ghost tale, but as a moral parable. One version, told in the dialect of Arles, claimed that a noblewoman traded her soul for beauty, and her servant traded body for freedom, and both were punished for seeking wholeness. Another claimed the mirror showed people not what they were, but who watched them when they were alone. The story spread beyond Provence. In Parisian salons, where mysticism remained fashionable, spiritualists used the Verlaine mirror as a metaphor for transgression, for desires society refused to name. Writers such as Emile Richbourg and Paul Féval alluded to a southern manner where man and woman saw themselves reversed, though neither ever cited the source directly. By 1880, the Verlaine legend had entered the realm of the academic. Professor Jules Renard of the Collège de France referenced it in a lecture on reflexive hysteria, citing a case in which an upper-class couple and a third party manifested alternating consciousness, as if governed by a single divided mind. Renard did not name them, but his description matched perfectly the notes of Dr. Armand. He interpreted the case not as supernatural, but as a psychological epidemic brought on by isolation and social repression. They sought unity in the mirror, he wrote, and found instead the terror of sameness. Still, outside the lecture halls, villagers swore otherwise. They avoided the old road by night, claiming that passing carriages would sometimes show an extra reflection in the window. A face that lingered just a moment too long. I saw a woman in white, one farmer's wife told a local paper in 1884. But when I crossed myself, it was me she was looking at. In the decades that followed, artists continued to reinterpret the Verlaine myth. The mirror appeared in etchings, stage plays, and even an early short film shot in 1908, now lost to nitrate decay. Each version blurred further the line between fact and invention. Yet through it all, one detail remained constant: the insistence that somewhere in the heart of Provence, the mirror's remnants still shimmered when moonlight struck the stones at a certain hour. Those who dared approach claimed the reflection was no longer human at all. It was something else entirely, something that watched back, patient, waiting for someone who recognized it. In 1909, nearly half a century after the disappearance at Maison, Verlaine, a stroke of coincidence reopened the case. During renovations to an old townhouse in Arles, workmen dismantled a false wall and uncovered a small iron coffer. Inside lay a collection of personal effects, an ivory comb, several coins, and a leather-bound journal bearing the initials J.V. The handwriting matched that of Julien Verlaine, the estate master whose death had been documented in 1862. The journal's early entries were mundane, concerned with vineyard accounts and estate maintenance. But as the pages turned toward the spring of 1862, a shift occurred. His prose grew increasingly agitated, his tone confessional. "I cannot bear the light in this house." One entry read, "It bends. It turns upon itself. The mirror has begun to show her before she enters the room." Julien wrote of sleepless nights, of Isabelle standing before the mirror whispering in two voices, one distinctly her own, the other softer, lower, like a hum through glass. He confessed to jealousy not of another man, but of something he could not name. "She speaks to the servant as though she speaks to herself. They move alike, breathe alike. When I close my eyes, I see one shadow walking behind them both." A later passage hinted at experimentation, burning herbs, mixing mercury into wax, lighting black and white candles at opposite ends of the mirror. He described it not as ritual, but as an act of balance, to see which soul the glass prefers. The final pages, dated just days before his death, are half-mad scrolls, alternating between two distinct handwritings on the same lines. His and, inexplicably, another more delicate hand believed to be Isabelle's. "The mirror must choose," it reads. "It cannot keep us all." The coffer also contained a folded page detached from the back of the journal. It bore a rough sketch of the mirror's frame with annotations in the margin. "Imported from St. Domingue, silver backing altered with vapors, for reflection of duality, to reveal the other self." The notation sparked immediate interest among scholars of colonial artifacts. If true, it confirmed earlier speculation by historian A. Lottie Marchand that the Verlaine family had brought the mirror from the Caribbean decades earlier, a relic possibly connected to indigenous or syncretic spiritual practices. The journal was turned over to the Société d'Histoire de Provence, where it was studied in depth between 1910 and 1912. Researchers debated whether the alternating handwriting proved possession, collaboration, or psychological breakdown. Some claimed it was the earliest European record of what modern psychology would call dissociative identity. Others insisted that two people had indeed written within the same moment, one using the mirror as a guide, the other following its reflection. One chilling detail cemented the journal's infamy: a faint brown fingerprint pressed into the last page, belonging to neither of the known signatories. The print appeared doubled, as though made by two overlapping thumbs. Following the journal's release to the public, Le Matin de Marseille published an article titled, "The Double That Writes," in 1911, reviving public fascination with the Verlaine legend. Spiritualists flocked to the region, claiming to hear the hum of the shared soul near the ruins at night. But the archivists noticed something stranger. Each time the journal was displayed under glass, its pages slowly warped inward, curling toward the center as if responding to unseen heat. Experts later blamed humidity, yet one curator privately remarked, "It is as if the words themselves wish to look upon each other." Within a year, the journal was sealed and placed in cold storage, labeled Object 1862 VR. And though countless replicas and forgeries surfaced over the next century, the original remains untouched. Its ink faded to sepia, its faint metallic odor lingering. The final entry in the Saint-Étienne Municipal Archives comes from a faded police memorandum dated March 1876. It references the demolition of the Maison Verlaine, undertaken quietly at dawn with only a handful of laborers and one city officer present. The building had stood empty for nearly 15 years, its shutters sealed, and its interior avoided by townsfolk who swore they could still hear slow, deliberate footsteps on the upper floors, long after midnight. Within the report, a line is struck through in ink, as if censored after the fact. Beneath the smudge, the faint impression remains. Bones, neither wholly male nor female, no measurements, no names, no further explanation. Only a note from Officer Duret. Remains consigned to municipal burial ground. No record to be kept. Afterward, the plot where the house stood was left undeveloped, though the Verlaine name persisted. A few decades later, local historian Henry Cloutier compared the surviving fragments of testimony to the writings of Alexandre Dumas, who once documented similar tales of divided identity and confinement during France's post-revolution years. Cloutier argued that the Verlaine case represented a sickness of spirit, not body, though even he confessed that no natural explanation satisfies the persistence of that voice. Visitors who walk the overgrown path today find nothing more than a line of foundation stones and a single fig tree whose roots curl around what appears to be a fragment of brick etched with two interlocking initials, A, V and LV. Whether those letters once marked the bond between husband and wife or something far stranger, none can say. Local shepherds still claim that on windless nights, one may hear murmured recitations in two alternating tones, one soft and melodic, the other low and near, whispering, blending seamlessly into one another, until the ear cannot tell which is which. Most dismiss it as trick of wind through the hills. Yet those who stay long enough describe a feeling not of fear, but of being watched, studied, as though the dual-souled presence of the house was still trying to decide which part of itself should speak first. The church bells of Saint-Étienne now toll over an empty lot, the records sealed, and the last descendants of the Verlaine line long gone. No modern registry lists them among the living. The few who study the case say it remains a mirror, half reflection, half absence, a story of desire split clean through by the limits of its own secrecy. And so, the Maison Verlaine is gone, but its shadow has not left. The soil remembers. The air still holds the trace of that forbidden obsession, never proven, never denied, that turned a house of wealth into a whispering ruin. If you stand there at dusk, when the fog slides low across the valley, some swear they can see two silhouettes in the mist, moving together, almost touching, until one fades first, leaving the other reaching into nothing. Even now, Saint-Étienne does not speak of the house by name. Those who remember simply call it La Demeure des Voix, the dwelling of voices. Children are told not to wander there after dusk, not because of ghosts, but because the air itself feels uneven, like breath drawn from two lungs that do not belong to the same body. Old masons who worked the demolition claimed that when the final wall fell, they heard what sounded like a sigh, one sorrowful, one relieved, fading into the mountain air. They dropped their tools and left before collecting their pay. No official report survives beyond that, only a loose page from a parish ledger that reads, "May their halves find peace." If peace still exists between them, the author's name is smudged, the ink blood by time. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of Maison Verlaine. Not the tragedy of what was done there, but the uneasy reminder that within every human heart, two voices may reside. And when neither can silence the other, what emerges is not life or death, but something that lingers, waiting to be remembered, yet never named aloud. If you ever find yourself walking through the misted outskirts of Saint-Étienne, and you feel as though someone unseen is keeping pace beside you, do not turn, for some stories are not meant to be watched, only felt, as they quietly continue in the space between your heartbeats.